later, assuming we can get her on. So let me introduce both Carl and Audrey, and we'll just hope that Audrey gets on here in a few minutes. But Audrey Zibelman, many of you know from her time either at the New York PSC or at PJM or at Veridity or maybe some other places that she's been over her career. She's certainly a well-known person in our industry. And I want to highlight the fact that she was on the Gridwise Alliance board a few years ago, and we were very pleased to have her participation in that as well. So hopefully she highlights that in her resume. But what some of you may not realize is that her last 4 years as the market operator in Australia has just recently come to an end. And I believe she's actually physically back in North America now, just recently, and will begin a new job at Google X. And I'll leave it to her to describe what that is when she gets a chance to join us. In the meantime, Carl, thanks for joining us, and thanks for putting this panel together for us. Today was Technology Day. We certainly covered a lot of different technologies. For those of you that have been part of the session all day long, I think we've done a pretty good job of covering the breadth and to some extent the depth of what's going on in the technology. But we would be remiss if we didn't include something on storage. And so when Carl and I started talking about this a few months ago, we thought it's probably a good thing for Carl to lead a panel that talks about storage and the impact that storage could have on the grid, partly because he leads the grid-related efforts at the Pacific Northwest Laboratory, but he also leads the Grid Lab Consortium effort for the Department of Energy, which has been ongoing now for the last three years or so. And one of the things, and I'll leave it to him to give you the details, is that the Department of Energy launched an effort over the last year that's really focused on storage and not just the technology development part, but also the deployment part. And so part of what this panel wants to talk about is some of the projects that have been, kind of exciting new leading edge projects in storage. And I'll leave it to Carl to introduce the other speakers. And Carl, turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Excellent, Steve. Can you hear me?
We can. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an awesome day. I hope everyone's enjoyed the sessions thus far. They started off this morning looking at the whole issues around accelerating the drive for resilience, as well as decarbonized power systems and around the world. That requires a lot of increased electrification at the state and utility level, creating lots of complexities and challenges for the utilities in terms of charging, et cetera. And this session is going to, as Steve mentioned, look really at the emerging role that energy storage is and will play in helping achieve multiple outcomes of the grid going forward: decarbonization and enhanced resilience. Our general premise is that these really have to be co-optimized. It needs to be a joint journey to make that happen. And so today's panel is going to look at this, sharing both experiences and lessons learned, as well as some sense of what's important going forward. So let me just set a little bit of context for before I introduce the panel. A lot of people wonder where we are on storage, and storage made a phenomenal transition over the last couple of years. I believe in 2019, globally, we saw about 10 gigawatt hours installed globally. Transportation storage is growing at about 3 to 4 times the rate of stationary storage. So transportation obviously is the early leader in the storage space. We have widespread state engagement at over, I think, 30 demonstrations that DOE is involved in working with energy storage, including one of the panelists today is part of, actually 2 of the panelists today, their companies are part of DOE energy storage activities. And of course, we keep moving the goalposts too, like everything else in life these days. The goalposts are getting moved. If you look at 2019, with the competition of natural gas is up to about 38% of the generation for electricity. Coal is below a quarter. It's at 23% now. Renewables continue to grow. Renewables plus hydro, or renewable hydro, are at about 17%. And so that's created some changes in the physics on the system. Inertia is changing. NERC's working hard trying to figure out what are the issues and impacts of changes in inertia. How do they deal with that? Looking at fast energy injection, of which energy storage is a critical resource for providing that. So really, all of these energy storage is going to be part of delivering flexibility to the system. Flexibility is going to be the coin of the realm going forward. You need it for resilience. You need it for energy storage. We traditionally got it off generation. Now we're going to have to get it on both sides of the meter, and we're going to have to look for flexibility everywhere place we can find it and find some way to harmonize it and make it all sing. So with energy storage, you heard earlier today, I think it's 23 states now have renewable portfolio standard requirements. That's pushing storage hard. I think there are about 8 states now that already have formal requirements for energy storage targets and goals, anywhere from 2 to 5 gigawatts between 2025 and 2035. So you see a really big uptick in terms of commitments to energy storage at the state level. But everyone's trying to figure out what's the best way to get there, how to make it happen. DOE has had a long involvement. The energy storage, the battery storage program for grid applications, it's about $80 million program each year. They are advancing concepts that are reduced dependence on special metals, trying to move away from lithium, move in towards orthoabundant materials, redox flow, zinc, other technologies. Their price points have come down from about $1,500 per kWh installed not too long ago. The systems now are looking at about $225, and the DOE goal is try to get it down to $125 per kWh. But almost equally important, they're looking at safety and reliability issues to fit the use cases for utilities. That's really key, is how do we deliver systems, not just batteries, but systems that perform well for the industry. And Steve mentioned DOE also launched in parallel a DOE Energy Storage Grand Challenge. It's a bigger tent and includes thermal storage and pumped hydro and all sorts of storage on both sides of the meter. It'll be about a 10-year initiative, and the general vision there is to innovate it here, build it here, and then deploy it everywhere. And DOE places a high premium on the deployment side of that as well. So that's another new major development that's emerging from the DOE side of things. One other investment DOE just recently committed to make is something around grid storage, trying to help accelerate and focus the rate of progress on grid storage. Most of the batteries utilities are buying today are lithium ion. The lithium ion journey started 40 years ago, and we can't afford to take another 40 years to kind of move to the next generation grid technologies that have the life cycle that we need for energy storage long term. That facility will be built at PNNL. It's entering into the construction phase now. And in addition to the technologies, you heard the CalISO chair mention this morning the need to help harmonize. How do you integrate DERs and energy storage to deliver flexibility to the system? And DOE has recently delivered a number of just breathtaking new tools I think are part of that. Our MISO worked with DOE and PNNL in developing the next generation solvers for security constrained unit commitment that speeds it up by about 20 to 30 times, takes it from a couple hours down to 20 minutes. And that's going to be really key to be able to look at how do you engage DERs in those bulk system markets. They've also developed, had a competition around new power flow solvers to enhance those using high performance computing. And that'll probably take about $10 billion, add $10 billion of reduced costs for ISO operations across the US. And they've also deployed a whole new range of new reference architectures looking at what do we need under a high DER or a high resilience future as the power system changes, the architecture and the business models change. So DOE is trying to deliver a lot of pieces to the puzzle that'll be important going forward. But now let's transition a little bit to what we want to talk about today. What we have today is 3 people from utility industry and 1 panelist from the research community to share with you their lessons learned on what they've experienced with energy storage in the not too distant past, and also some sense of where things are going into the future. And let me just introduce them quickly. Starting at the co-op and the consumer-owned side of things, we have Clay Koplin, who's the CEO of Cordova co-op in Cordova, Alaska. It's a remote application. Solar Remote Clay is also the mayor of the community, but he's a long-term power engineer, and he's also a member of the Electricity Advisory Committee with DOE, and so he's very, very connected to the whole DOE agenda. Switching to the IOUs, we have Zak Kuznar, who's the managing director for regulated renewables for Duke, and that covers 6 states, 6 different jurisdictions. And I understand where he got the hairdo that he has, trying to deal with 6 different regulatory bodies and trying to bring renewables forward across all those different jurisdictions. Audrey Zibelman will be joining us, I am sure, from Australia soon. And she brings more of the ISO perspective, not only from the last 4 years in Australia, but also from her time at PJM and other places here in the US in the past. And then Jeff Dagle will be the last speaker, and he is a senior person at PNNL. He leads the transmission program, research program at PNNL. He also leads the North American Synchrophaser Initiative for DOE that has over 80 utilities participating in it. And he's also worked on a recent National Academy study on resilience that was, I think, released in 2018. And so he has very good insights just in terms of a lot of the industry insights around energy resilience. So at this point, we're going to transition to the speakers. And Clay, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you're on.
Okay, thank you, Carl. I have good sound quality.
Very good.
Okay, first I just want to mention on the left-hand side of your screen, if you're on the stage at the bottom, there's an expo link. And if you follow that, there's some booths in there. And Cordova Electric has a booth in there with a slideshow with some pictures and a little bit of background on Cordova Electric. And also down below that, some links to recent articles and videos on our battery energy storage system. So Cordova, the community of Cordova is located on the boundary between southeast and south central coastal Alaska on the east edge of Prince William Sound. And we have a coastal rainforest climate where we get about 150 inches or 5 meters of annual precipitation. So water is our primary energy resource, but it mostly comes in the summer. So central power was established in Cordova in 1907 with the hydro project. And because we're not connected by a road system or transmission lines to other communities, we've truly been a standalone remote microgrid for over 110 years. So in the past 20 years, we've gone through some rapid grid advancements, and we've built 2 run-of-the-river hydroelectric projects. So they're use it or lose it river flow projects, where we have excess energy in the summer quite often, but then in the winter we have to supplement with diesel almost to 100% as our cold winter months freeze up the rivers. We also converted all of our power lines, both our 15 kilovolt lines and our 25 kilovolt hydro transmission lines, to 100% underground and submarine cables. And then we fully automated our system around 2002 so that we could automatically and very efficiently transition back and forth between diesel and hydro. We have 3 megawatt peaks in the winter, and we have a very, very dynamic load profile in the summer where we peak at 9 megawatts, and we have large blocks of power moving very quickly as our seafood processors freeze and process fish. So our energy storage challenges here at Cordova Electric are for short time scale energy, for regulation of frequency and spinning reserve. We'd also like to have longer time scale energy storage where we could seasonally shift our summer water into winter and get completely off of diesel, but that's going to take other technologies. So we used to provide that spinning reserve and frequency response by deflecting water at our larger hydroelectric project. And we had to deflect 750 kilowatts of capacity. That allowed us to be 100% hydro, but as our fishing industry and system loads grew, we just don't have that much water available. So it's forcing us into using a lot of diesel energy. So when we approached the Department of Energy's Energy Research Program, storage research program led by Dr. Emery Juk, he commissioned Sandia Labs and Pacific Northwest National Labs and the Alaska Center for Energy and Power to use our 20-year 1-second resolution data set to model different storage technologies on our system. And we settled on lithium-ion battery energy storage as a right-sized, as the right technology. And then we right-sized and right-located that in our system with dynamic modeling. So some of the things we learned through that process is that you need to carefully engineer a system, as always, to meet your local environmental conditions, heavy rain, snow, temperature extremes, etc., and your seismicity and other challenges. In our case, tsunami zones and so forth. Then choose capable vendors, both on the inverter and battery side, that have good technical skills and business stability so that they can work through technical issues with you. We learned that capacity loss when you're talking about energy storage is in terms of kilowatt hours. So you maintain your kW peak demand capacity, but you lose storage capacity over time. One of those losses is through calendar aging. That can be as much as 1.5% and as little as 0.5% on some of the new chemistries. This is really important for our application of balancing our entire microgrid with the battery. Deep cycling for complete charge and complete discharge cycles will wear out your battery, will reduce its storage capacity rather quickly. Whereas if you use shallow discharges on the order of 5% or less for grid balancing, for example, you can extend your life dramatically. We're hoping for 3 decades, and we increased our throughput by a factor of 100, from 5 gigawatt hours of delivered storage to 500 gigawatt hours. Frequency controls can occur while you're doing bulk charging or discharging, so you can manage your frequency response and do arbitrage discharges and recharges. In our case, to maximize hydropower at 6 cents compared to diesel at 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Our recycling costs look about like 60% of initial package cost, but by using a modular system, we can really just make modular changes over time, and we think the cost and performance will continue to improve. Our delivery time was less than 12 months from order to fully commissioned. Factory warranties and annual maintenance are a fairly expensive component, and a lot of those depend on the control algorithms that you develop on your customer side and with your vendors to model how quickly the system will degrade based on your use case. Integrating battery energy storage into a microgrid, like any other integration on a microgrid, is costly and complex. It's performance space where you really have to have 100% on time. If you're relying on it to balance your grid, one simple communications failure, one simple failure of your battery energy storage system can cause system-wide outage in the worst case. We expect, and we're already seeing, significant improvements of our value and use cases as we carefully monitor and iterate through our control algorithms. So at the end of the day, this system improved our system resilience pretty dramatically. With a 100% underground system, we have very few outages, almost 15 years since we've had a storm-related outage, despite our extreme climate. So this system made renewables more available by liberating that 750 kilowatts of hydro capacity. Not only can we balance our whole grid with the battery, but in a degraded case where, say, we lose half of our system to a tsunami inundation, we can still use that battery to balance whatever is left available, whether it's just one hydro plant or maybe some diesel as well. Just in the last 36 months, to give you an idea of the dynamics of our region here, we've had volcanic eruptions, which can shut your diesel plant down with wind-blown ash, avalanches in our hydro projects, superstorms with heavy rain and snow and 100 mile an hour plus winds, which is pretty normal for us, and 3 earthquakes in the medium to high 7s on the Richter scale, which almost always generate tsunami alerts and evacuations. So this system allows us to help keep critical loads either continuously in service or to be interrupted for shorter time durations during those system disruptions, and frankly, during the events where you most need energy to help support your community's infrastructure. Our grid balancing battery energy storage system also makes a lot larger scale wind and solar integrations onto our grid more feasible, because we have that balancing capacity now. So looking out into the future, we are currently implementing the use of our battery energy storage system for black start and cyber black start capabilities. We designed those in on the front end, and we're actually testing and iterating through those. We think that there are future key regional or defense critical energy infrastructure sites where we can help improve their resilience through either connecting to our grid or deploying similar systems in their neighborhood, and potential for even doing some smart grid signaling through inverter manipulation on the grid. And we're excited by the potential in one use case to use battery energy storage plus tidal energy to be able to deliver levelized year-round grid quality power to remote locations. And we think that has applications around the state. So thank you, and I look forward to some questions.
Thank you very much, Clay. I knew you lived in a tough neighborhood, but not that tough. Volcanoes, earthquakes, tsunamis, all in a good work week, huh? So we're going to transition a little bit back to Audrey. She's able to get her technical difficulties worked out. So Zach and Jeff, I'm going to ask you guys to hold off for just a sec and let Audrey go ahead and proceed with her keynote, and then we'll get back to Zach and Jeff. All right, Audrey.
Thank you. So we're now, I get to join from the other part of the world. Hi, everybody.
Welcome, Audrey.
All right, and I apologize for technical difficulties. I think I have some slides, and Carl, I didn't know if you wanted me to just start there or.
I believe so. I think Richie was going to advance the slides for, as I understand it, but.
Yeah, I think so.
I appreciate you working so hard on your first day off.
It's a pleasure.
Rich says it's going to take 2 minutes to get the slides up, so I think you can.
Okay, well, I can, interest of time, since I didn't want to delay. So what I want to do today is I'll give everybody, for those of you who are not quite familiar with the Australian framework, a little bit of background of what's happening in Australia and how we're using storage increasingly as a resource for the power system. So just for orientation, we actually have 3 interconnections in Australia. The largest is the Eastern interconnection, which is what we call the National Energy Market, and covers the 3 major there's 4 major eastern states, which is going from Queensland, the Great Barrier Reef, and down to South Australia, but also a single interconnection into Tasmania. And as a result, that it's a very long and skinny system. It's more than 5,000 kilometers. So we rank it as one of the longest, skinniest power systems in the world, and has about 40,000 kilometers of transmission lines, serving 10 million customers. So compared to certainly the US system, it's longer, skinnier, and a lot less dense. The reason why this is significant is because, of course, in Australia, we're dealing with a very different climate than Clay has, with a lot of hot summers, a lot of bushfires, and a real need to think about how we both do connections for integration of renewables, but also creating resiliency around these climatic events. And the big story is how renewables and storage are playing into this, both the current and future. And as soon as I get my slides, I could talk a little bit about what's happening and the pace of change. Hi, Richard. And I think, Richard, you're going to run the slides. There we go. So, Richard, we can go to the slide 3, the profound changes. There you go. So the thing that's really phenomenal to me happening in Australia now is just how quickly the transition has occurred and is occurring. I'm right now the CEO of the Australian Energy Market Operator, and we run the grid operations through all of the country. And as part of this role, we develop what we call the Integrated System Plan, which is our view of what's going to happen on the power system over the next 15 to 20 years. The major thing for Australia is, since it's been a dominant coal reliance country, is that we're expecting 63% of our coal fleet to retire over this period of time, simply due to aging. And as a result, that's essentially having to rebuild the power system in the next 10 to 15 years. The thing that's changed so significantly is that for us, renewables, wind, solar, and storage represent the least cost alternative to replacing the coal. Australia does not allow nuclear, And gas here, while it's it plays a very significant role, the price of natural gas is at least double, maybe triple what we expect to see in the US. And so it's a competing resource with storage. The thing that's happened though here is in the last 3 years is just, as profound as we think about what's going on. So what I've been amazed about is the pace of change. So in the last 3 years, we've gone from 6 to 45 grid scale solar farms, which is about a 710% increase in solar. And that serves at this point 1 million households in Australia. We also have gone from 36 to 52 large wind farms, which is a 50% increase. And the other big story is rooftop solar. So in Australia, we're looking at people putting solar on their roofs about one every 6.5 minutes. So we're seeing a phenomenal change and expect that by during this period, we're going to see rooftop solar producing 22%. It could be up to a third, depending on what's happening on storage. And the advantage, of course, we have in Australia is the fact that it's a huge landmass with a low population base. So we can actually accommodate this level of renewables. Our challenges, the system operation challenges of operating a power system like this, which has such a vast area to cover. We go to the next slide. So the growth that we're expecting is in distributed resources is very significant. All of the states are looking at programs around embedding storage into their systems, as well as starting to look at electric vehicles. So for us, in running the power system, it's really going to be around how can we create and manage a two-way power system, since so much of our energy is going to be distributed. We go to the next slide. We've had today, and people may have heard about the Hornsdale battery, but we've had significant battery growth, and sort of in many ways it seems to be that it's the growth of the large batteries, because every 2 weeks or so we're getting the largest battery announced, and we've just announced another one. But what we've found is, on a system operations basis, is that batteries have provided a very important resource in operations of the grid. Certainly in terms of fast response, it's been critical. The ability for batteries to flex up and down, but also we're using it for regulation service as well as inertia type services. The things that what we've discovered through managing power system, which increasingly it's sometimes 100% renewables, is the need to make sure that we can configure it so that the complementary resources around inertia, system strength, and voltage management can be managed through these various devices. And batteries have provided a very flexible capability to do that. We, last summer, we had an event after the bushfires where we had a microstorm that knocked down one of our major interconnectors that connected South Australia to Victoria. And we were in a position where we actually had to restore the grid in a couple of hours. Otherwise, we would have lost a major aluminum producing facility, which probably would have ended up killing off 1,400 jobs in a region. So a very significant event for us in the system. We had to reconfigure the system in order to allow South Australia to operate in an islanded state throughout the summer. And we were able to do that because of the fact that we had a combination of storage as well as gas facilities that could help manage the state in this configuration and until we can get a second line put in. And so it's that kind of flexibility and capability that we see is extremely valuable moving forward. We go to the next slide. The other piece for us is the solar story. So with this uptake of rooftop solar, one of the things that we're confronting right now is this issue of which, and I know some of it occurs in California, is minimum demand. So we're expecting, and this is actually a real slide of projections of where we're headed, is that by actually next year in 2021 in South Australia, we could be in a position where we're going to have many hours, we're going to have zero demand on the system just because of the rapid uptake of rooftop solar. And that's going to happen in other states as well. The challenge, of course, for us is when we have minimum operational demand is managing voltage and frequency on the distribution system. So while we talk about it as the duck curve in the US, we've decided to rename it the emu curve in Australia because it's such a very, very deep valley. And so the question then becomes is how do we manage that? Because we obviously can't manage the system. And I had to go out last year and say, look, if things, happen, just like you have to shed load during peak, we may have to shed solar during these periods. And that had the same reaction of telling consumers that you were going to knock them off in very hot days. They weren't very pleased to hear that the grid operator, and the worst thing is, of course, this isn't an unusual peak day that we're managing this. This is a very beautiful sunny afternoon in the spring and the fall when you have low demand and high solar. So those are the kind of challenges we're starting to confront. We go to the next slide. So one of the things we've done now in terms of how do we operate the power system is last year AMO published what we call our renewable integration study, which is rapidly becoming just our engineering study. And it's this staff really looking through and saying, okay, what are the various configurations of the system that we're going to need to be able to accomplish as we look at higher and higher penetration of renewables. And we broke it down in hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds, and are starting now to break through and say, well, what are these complements of resources that are going to be necessary to manage the system during these periods, as well as, of course, the decision tools that are going to be necessary for system operators to be able to actually deal with a grid, which has really literally gone from hundreds of systems to millions of systems that need to be coordinated. And a big part of that is in this seconds and milliseconds, as well as the minutes, but is the role that storage is going to play in helping with this very fast grid and dynamics changes on the power system. We go to the next slide. The one area that we're doing a lot of work on is working with distribution utilities and how we're going to be able to use virtual power plants to help with system management. So, I know everyone, I'm sure in this audience, is very familiar with the use of VPPs for demand response and things like that. We're moving it to the next level of trying to understand is how we're going to be able to use these things to co-optimize the system, where we're not just looking at the issue of resource or supply management, but also really thinking in terms of the system security management and what combination of devices and how we can create operating envelopes so that we can manage the system during all these periods of time and really manage it from the edge of the system in coordination with the distribution utility and the NAEMO. What we're finding this past year is that we've discovered that the ability to use batteries at the distribution edge was also an ability for us to provide fast responding regulation services, which help maintain voltage on the power system. And so it was a very promising way of creating this two-way system. We go to the next slide. Which is really the final. So I think to me, the things that we're beginning to think about, and I think it was an interesting way to solve the issue, is really look at the transition that's happening in the power system. And I hope will be sort of part of what the panel talks about is really how do you manage the security of the system. So we all know that resources can be used to both inject supply and withdraw demand. And I think we've kind of passed, I hope I just saw the FERC's latest iteration of this, that from a grid operator standpoint of keeping balance and security on the system, they're indifferent as whether you're injecting supply or withdrawing demand as long as they can defend it. And so the challenge of managing against peaks is a pretty well-solved challenge if we can shift load against the peaks. Today, what we're seeing at AEMO is really thinking about, well, there's that issue, right? And then there's this other issue of how to manage the troughs and how do we shift load into those areas using things like electric vehicles and sector coupling and storage to soak up the sunny afternoons, and starting to work through from a regulatory standpoint, who's got what role and how to do this most efficiently in the power system. And it's an active debate to us today as to how we solve these things. The objective, though, that we're running into, and I think is a really sound way to look at this, is actually to start thinking about, well, there's an issue for us of hardening the systems. And last year, and we could talk about this more in the bushfires, we really saw the need to be able to have microsystems to protect people when they're feeling most vulnerable. But the thing that I'm very excited about is this concept that we're working on, is creating these dynamic operating envelopes through the distribution utility, using distributed energy resources as an effective tool. Because yes, we could spend millions of dollars of hardening the distribution system, making it more intelligent, and being able to see how we could operate the distribution system like a transmission system. Another way to doing it would be to say, well, there is an operating envelope that you could calculate and say, in any given circumstance, this is where we should try to balance demand and supply at the distribution level. That's an envelope by which the distribution system feels that they can operate safely. And that becomes a much easier problem to solve once you start adding storage to the mix, because you can keep the distribution system at that level and essentially creates that balance. In many ways, I think that's the most exciting part of the market, is we can provide that intelligence through, and very much like how we manage frequency on the grid, where we manage it within a certain envelope, we just do the same at the distribution level, knowing that it doesn't have to be static, because it will change, and then create the market environment for using these resources. So I'm looking forward to the questions, the rest of the panel. And I apologize for being a bit late. I would say I was trying to travel from Australia, but you guys know that's not true. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Audrey. All right, Zach, let's transition back to you. You can come up.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Great, Zach. Well, yours, sir.
Great. Well, great. Thanks, everybody. I won't take too long. Like Carl mentioned, so I lead up a group at Zuk Energy where we really focus on growing a lot of our distributed resources. So we're responsible for energy storage, microgrids, small gas turbines, and also more distributed solar resources. And also, like Carl did mention, we're doing this in 6 states, and all 6 of our states are so different, depending on the regulators and where priorities are kind of falling. But we do, believe it or not, in the Midwest, so Ohio, Indiana, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Florida. And if you look at North Carolina has the second most solar out of any state in the United States out of California. So we're starting to see issues that the intermittency of solar generation can provide the system. But with regards to energy storage, pumped hydro is something we've had for almost since the early 70s. A lot of that was built when we were initially bringing online a lot of our nuclear reactors. So about 3,000 megawatts of pumped hydro. But getting pumped hydro built now with some of the lights is quite difficult. So we've been, for about the past 10 years, doing a number of pilot projects with energy storage. We did receive some of the ARA grant funding back about 10 years ago. The commercial side of our business built a 36 megawatt, 24 megawatt hour battery in Texas, which is adjacent to about 150 megawatt wind farm in a town that's actually called No Trees, Texas. Okay, is everyone, I hear it's getting a little choppy. Is it okay? Okay, great. So, we've got currently under construction in those 6 states, we've got about 80 megawatts of electrochemical storage that we're building. And we've got about 100 more megawatts just kind of in our pipeline. looking at really a number of different use cases. So we've got some projects which are focused on distribution deferral. We've got projects which are adding solar plus battery storage to provide resiliency to some communities that are in the western part of North Carolina that are in very mountainous regions. And so it was the best alternative for us to increase reliability to those areas. And we've got projects that we're building strictly to deal with kind of the intermittency that renewables like solar causes. Some of our projects are providing primary frequency response to the bulk system. And then we're building our first solar plus battery project down in Florida, where we're pairing the solar on the DC side of the inverter to capture energy. So we've got a number of different use cases that we're deploying. We're definitely moving more from R&D, the smaller kind of kilowatt systems to kind of, I have 10. Our largest battery is going to be over 30 megawatts. So we've got a number of different applications, number of different use cases. But right now, we're primarily using lithium for all of these applications. Just from a contract standpoint, commercial availability. But we're very batteries, so we're testing some metal air batteries. Very interested in evaluation of flow batteries. But again, our projects that we're looking at really span the distribution system, the transmission system, and we're looking at really use cases that are across both of those as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Zach, very much. And let's transition now to Jeff Dagle. And again, I asked Jeff to sort of look at some of the cross activities going on in the National Academy and DOE and NERC and all the resilience, just to sort of show how they sort of connect in some of these use cases you guys have shared. Jeff.
Great, thanks, Carl. I'm going to cover 3 topics. The first one is on standards and some of the interconnection requirements. I think most people are aware of the IEEE 1547 that applies to distributed energy resources connected to distribution. But what NERC and others through the NERC Inverter-Based Resources Task Force and some events that have occurred in the system, we're discovering that the inverter-based resources, and we're talking about storage, and unless you're dealing with hydro, it's most likely an inverter. But it applies to inverter-based generation, could be wind turbines or solar or other things. Connected to the transmission system, there needs to be some attention given to that. And really clarifying the requirements of these resources, and specifically how they're different than synchronous machines. And many of the NERC connection requirements are based at implicit assumption of connecting synchronous machines to the system. These new requirements are very important, particularly in fast timescales. The second thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was resilience. This has been mentioned several times throughout the last 2 days of the gridCONNECT workshop. Carl mentioned a few minutes ago the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine put together a report that I put the URL in the chat, and serves as a good framing of resilience activities associated with things that we can do to enhance resilience and specific recommendations that can be made to enhance resilience. Storage, of course, figures into that very prominently. Whether we're talking about fast-acting storage that can be used for some of these grid services to help prevent problems from starting or cascading, to longer-term storage that could be used to, and Reiko mentioned this a bit in her remarks a few minutes ago in the previous panel about, what would be the value of things that extend beyond hours, days of storage. And that's another thing that the current cost and technologies need to go a while to catch up on. I will mention that new National Academy's report that will be issued in the spring called The Future of Electric Power in the United States. So it's beyond storage. It gets into the other aspects of grid modernization, including affordability and sustainability and security and reliability, flexibility, in addition to resilience. And that's going to be coming out soon. The report is in its review stages. And then the last thing I just wanted to talk about is some of the applications of energy storage. You know, and other speakers have talked about the non-wires solutions that you can deploy for enhancing the system from a reliability perspective and kind of covering the N-1. Other bulk system applications in terms of not only load leveling, but economically dispatching the storage and to help mitigate against the non-dispatchable resources. And the way I like to think of this is in the past, historically, we have forecasted demand and we dispatch supply. And I think in the future, when we have more wind and solar in our system, we're going to be doing more forecasting supply, and we're going to need to dispatch both supply and demand. And storage appears very prominently in there as well as flexible demand. So we're going to be doing a lot more of that, and I think thinking about fast-acting storage and the role of primary frequency response to provide reserve, synthetic inertia, and those types of things are going to be very important. And just the last thought here is the process of value stacking. When you have multiple benefits that you're trying to derive from these installations, it's important to understand the engineering limitations of how the storage device can be dispatched, but then capture the different value streams that can come off of that and be deployed accordingly. So Carl, I'll turn it back to you for the questions.
Excellent, Jeff. Thank you, everybody. And sound is a little choppy, so please talk close to your mic. That was a fantastic survey in terms of some very compelling and diverse experiences you guys have all experienced thus far. And time for about 2 questions, and I'm going to pose these to most of the panelists. And let's start a little bit at this notion. Audrey kind of teed it up with working with the distribution companies in terms of their dynamic envelopes, some of the architecture work that DOE's been doing, looking at the distribution system operator model, and I'll point to the need to have coordination and control and observability across the traditional transmission and distribution boundary. Zach, I'd start with you, since you've seen a lot of different use cases and probably some different regulatory models, and then go to Audrey and Clay, talking a little bit about what do you see that needs to be done to help better coordinate at that transmission distribution boundary, sort of a new way, and how do we achieve that in a world that's changing so fast? It's hard for the regulatory community to keep up. Starting with you, Zach, and then going to Audrey and then Clay.
Yeah, and I'll hit that at a high level. So, I think one of the things that allows us to be pretty flexible is if you look at really the Carolinas, Florida, Indiana, and Kentucky, in those states we own transmission, generation, and distribution. So easy for me to coordinate with distribution engineers. We're trying to find, let's say an area that might be basically be used to do peak shaving, and then look at how that kind of scales up to the bulk system. So I think having that probably a little more unique for us, because we can interact with our distribution engineers, transmission engineers, but then also generation. And one thing we've done just in general at Duke is just planning. For years we've always been very focused on generation planning, transmission planning, and distribution planning. And we're trying to get to a point, we're calling it integrated system optimization and planning, ISOP, which really will look across all three. So if you've got maybe a more distributed, as you get more distributed, having distributed solar and how that trickles up to the bulk system, or distributed storage, how that trickles up to the bulk system, I think the planning needs to change. And again, we've got a number of different, as a company, we're trying to get to 50% net carbon by 2030 and 100% by 2050. And so, storage and renewables aren't going to be the only part of that. We're looking at a number of different, electrolysis and how do you burn hydrogen in some of our base load plants. And, we've got a pretty big nuclear fleet, which we plan on keep operational. but storage will be a part of that. And so having that kind of more comprehensive planning process where you're looking at generation, transmission, and distribution and how some of these technologies can span potentially all three, that's going to be a critical part of our planning.
Audrey, to you.
Yeah, well, our approach is a bit different. So because we have system operations separate from distribution operations and multiple owners, it's an issue really of coordination. One of the things that we've begun exploring, and I think, and I'd like to see sort of develop further, is creating really a single platform between the distribution system operations and the grid operations, so that you're actually able to collect the information that you're going to need in order to be able to verify where the system is operating. So you have that analytic capability. And then it goes into the DERM systems and the EMS systems simultaneously. Because what we're thinking is a world where you don't have an integrated monopoly, but rather you have separate owners. The distribution utility is going to have the same visibility as the system operator to be able to be aware of what's happening on the grid. But the distribution system utility can have operational control of its own system with the ability to verify with the grid operators so they actually see what's happening on the system. I think, Carl, when I saw your note, I learned a new term. And it is, I think, going to be this seamless co-optimization that's going to have to occur, where both operators are effectively getting the information they need to be able to make the decisions that have to be made, and to be able to verify that those decisions are going to have to be made. So I think what we need to think about is the architecture of the system being moved to a much more distributed basis, and that it, just as Zak is doing it within Duke, we do this through data exchanges essentially among owners, and the ability then to compartmentalize who needs to see what information so that the decisions can be made essentially simultaneously. So that's where I think we're headed. And but the other piece is going to have to be the ability to really look at real-time data and information that could be secured, and the tools that are going to be necessarily to be able to make that predictive analysis. The other piece that I'd be interested to hear, Zak's experience, it's just so much information. And if you scale this up to a regional scale, you obviously can't have the operators making these decisions. It has to be a machine-to-machine co-optimization. Otherwise, we won't be able to continue to add on to the systems.
Thank you. So Clay, I know you're not connected to a transmission system, but you have some other unique interdependencies in your situation. Anything you want to add to the coordination frame or?
No, really just that when our customers own everything in the stack from their toaster up to the generating plants and everything, and we're not naturally grid connected, so we don't have NERC and FERC guidelines to follow, and or even rate deregulated by vote of our customers from the state regulatory. It's kind of a wild west. It's a playground where we can really test and deploy new technologies with very little interference or regulatory headwinds. And that kind of begs the questions for emerging technologies like inverter-based technologies and energy storage technologies, smart grid technologies. Should we be regulating those before we really develop the use cases for them? I think maybe some exemptions and a little bit of latitude might help, develop these use cases.
Okay, I'm going to get back to the concept of the inverters going forward, because we seem to have a bit of chaos in the marketplace in terms of lack of standards and approaches to control and everything else. But before we do, Jeff, I'd like to ask you to speak a little bit to Audrey's question around co-optimization. Jeff, DOE program, grid modernization programs, coordinates a lot of the work in the EMS or control space, system operations, et cetera. Jeff, can you give a feel for kind of where you see these issues around high velocity, high volume data sets being linked to more machine-to-machine decision-making and all in the control systems for co-optimization?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have 2 hours for the answer to that, right? Great framing of the question, Carl, and yeah, that is one of the big frontiers right now. Is I would say in the past several years, the industry has been doing much more about deploying more systems at transmission and distribution levels that generate data, and agree that the real holy grail is when we're having sort of the human overseeing the device-to-device decision-making process rather than everything being human in the loop. And but getting there, we're going to need to have a lot more capabilities developed in terms of not only the computational ability to through like things like parallel computing and optimization routines and things like that, but also some new algorithms in the area of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and say also physics informed AI and ML, because the grid is the grid, and there are laws of physics there that need to be obeyed, and structures that are there that can be put in as constraints. So I don't know if it necessarily needs to be an open optimization process that uses generic AI technologies, but definitely I do see a lot of opportunities there to come up with more effective algorithms for optimizing these systems going forward. And Carl alluded to, there's several efforts underway at the US Department of Energy, but I'm sure elsewhere where we're have a number of research projects in these areas.
Thank you, Jeff. And so very quickly, we're down to about 2 or 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask each of the utility speakers to just spend about 60 seconds talking a little bit about your experience with inverters and power electronics, and what you think is sort of the public goods or federal role going forward in the area of standards and coordination to help ensure there's a little bit of an order in that Wild West world going forward. Starting with Zach, Audrey, and then Clay.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks. Yes, I'm not. I mean, I deal with our standards group quite a bit, but it's definitely not my forte. But one thing I can say is, just when you have some of these distributed technologies on the system, one thing we really we thought about before we started deploying batteries. If you look at our 6 states, it's about 60 gigawatts of generation, so it's pretty significant. And as we started looking at integrating battery storage into our system, both on the distribution system and transmission system, one thing we really spent some time doing is we standardized on a local controller, and then how that local controller would then back into our distribution control center if it's distribution tied, or our energy control center if it's more of a generation resource. And and a lot of that was just to ensure that we were consistent with our control technology, because starting to think about, it's one thing to control a large gas facility where it's staffed and where you have people there and it's producing 1,000 megawatts, but when you get to the point where you've got maybe a 5 megawatt unit here, maybe a 100 megawatt unit here, and they're doing the apps basically embedded in that controller are telling it to do primary frequency response, or to do peak shaving, or to deal with solar intermittency. Having that standardized control system was really important for us, just in order to, I don't say make it easy, but to make it easier when you're trying to control them, instead of having 5 or 6 different controllers out.
Well, Audrey, do you have a quick comment on the controls, please?
Yes. So a couple things, Carl. I think we need to get smart inverters, but the biggest issue that we've run into is the ability to deal with ride-through events. And that's both on rooftop solar as well as grid-scale renewables. And so the ability for these controllers to have standards around ride-throughs and things like that. Also, it's going to be really important to have standards and requirements around the ability to change controls remotely. One of the things that happens, of course, is you program the system to work in a certain way, and if somebody remotely decides to change a control and you don't know about it, as a system operator, you're really in the dark. And so I think that we need to have it internationally. This group that we formed, and I know the labs are with the Global Power System transformation operators group where we're working with the labs. That I think is going to be a really big part. And if we can make this standardized throughout the world, then there's could be confidence on grid operators that they know how these devices are going to respond in different scenarios.
Okay, thank you very much. Clay, I apologize. The top of the hour just clicked off and I need to bring it to close. But we'll hold your feedback for the next opportunity. And I want to say what a privilege it was to work with you all on what is really a very compelling challenge going forward. I know 5 years ago I said it was the most exciting time ever in the grid, and I'm saying the same thing. And I think it's really going to be a phenomenal transformation. And we need to find ways to collaborate and innovate faster to get this whole ball moving faster. We can't afford the 40 years that it took for lithium ion. So great comments, great suggestions, and thank everybody for your attention. Back to you, Rich.
Thanks, Carl. Thanks, all.
Hey, thanks, Carl. You can't see me, but you can hear me. And I think it's just a wonderful day talking about technology, and interesting about the last question you asked of just controls and simplification. And, here we are in the day of, in a new platform here digitally and coming to you virtually. And there's so many different ways that we connect with each other now. A metaphor of what Zach just said of simplification and standardization might do everybody some help just in how we all connect and communicate with each other. So I appreciate this session though, and thank you, Carl, for leading us here and closing up our day, and really just wrapping up a day about technology, but what does it mean to other things? Not just about technology. What does it mean to people and to organizations and to this country? And the poll that we had up that a bunch of you to fill out, Carl, it was 100% unanimous that the U.S. is behind Europe and Australia. And so, I think you just put it right there. There's a lot to do, and I think it can be accelerated for sure. So thank you for doing that and for closing our day here. Tomorrow is going to focus on city and energy clusters and creating macro and micro grids, and really hearing from investors of how do we make all this work together. And so it's a day really around corporates and investors that are driving change. Today we heard about technology, and yesterday was policy. So we hope everyone will join us. If you would like to join us in networking, you can see it's live now on the left-hand side. You can meet somebody. You've been listening all day. I appreciate that. And now you can go maybe go face-to-face and meet somebody who's been listening to you as well. So I'll see somebody over there in just a minute. Carl, any last words here to close us out?
Nope, that's great. Thank you so much, Rich.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Carl. Take care.
All right. Bye, everybody.